Hello, thanks for watching. Today we are going to talk about Blazor versus Angular. Which one you should choose in your applications, right? Now before I continue, please remember to subscribe to the channel and invite more people so we can get more subscribers and keep making more training videos for you. Also, please like the videos and share them in your social networks. Okay, so let's continue. Here I have a default Angular application created with the default template in Visual Studio 2019, right? This is a .NET Core application which has it tells or prepares the um, indicates which is your client application root path, right? So it says add the SPA static files, and you will tell it use this root path, which will be the client app slash this, right? So when you start your application, it will start there, right? Well, that will be for when you compile it, right? And you tell it use the SPA, it will be in the source path client app, right? If it's in development, we will use the Angular client server, and it will start the application to, of course, start the Angular server, right? And it will load your client application in your browser, right? So it tells to go to the client app, and in the client app you will have this application, and you will have an index.html, which will be the first page the browser will load, right? Okay, this index.html will usually have a tag, an HTML tag that maps to the main Angular application component. This is actually a selector which should be defined in your application folder somewhere around there, and you will see that this app.component.ts is, it tells that this component is going to be mapped to this selector. So when you use this selector, this component will be executed and it will be here. It will use this component.html, which will be the actual HTML for that page, let's say, right? And this is the basic configuration for your application. See that you have a body, have an app menu item, right? And you will have also the router, right? So this nap menu should be defined somewhere around here, probably in here, nap menu. So you will have this .ts, which will be another Angular component, right? It will be mapped to this selector, which we already saw. It will use this HTML, and it will use this .css, right? And the component will define all of these methods and properties that it will need, right? The HTML will have the actual HTML for that component. In this case, you will see that we have navigation bar, some container, right? The anchor or the link, right? And some buttons, right, along with the actions, right? So for example, when you click in this navigation item for for the toggle navigation, it will toggle, right? Let's see what else we have. This home, right? So this home will go to this link. This counter will go to this link, and the fetch data will go to this link, and you will see that, for example, if we want to go to the fetch data, the router will actually find a component that has defined that actually somewhere around here we should have the paths, right? So when we configure the application module, you will see that for the blank path we will use the home component. For the counter path we will use the counter component, and for the fetch data path we will use the fetch data component, right? Oh, sorry. If I go to the fetch data component, you will see that we have in here, okay, this is the selector, this is the HTML, this is the class for the component, and we have all of the information required. We also see that in this case we have a defined interface which will have the contract for the data, for the properties contained in the data we are going to receive from the call to this endpoint. Okay, so this is calling base URL plus weather forecast. The base URL should actually be defined in here with the base href, and you will see that in here we should probably have the controller. We have this weather forecast controller, and this weather forecast controller, the only thing that it implements is an HTTP GET that is not named, so it will by default use this method, right? So when we invoke that API from the client side, it will execute this and return the data in this format. Now you will see something in here, right? We define the weather forecast 2 times. We have to define it in the C# code if we want to use strong types, right? And we also have to define it in our client side application inside the fetch data component. You can actually use other file if you want to, right? But you have to define it in here. So that's actually one of the things or the weak points of Angular. You need to do it if you want to have strong types, right? But it creates duplicates, right? Because you have to handle the models in both your server side and in your client side, and you can create also inconsistencies, right? Because you need to make sure that you are always synchronizing them, right? Okay. The other thing that I didn't tell you is that when you create your application from your TypeScript application from the start, you may have to wait a little bit if you are using the default Visual Studio template, right? Because you have to download the node models, right? Granted, apparently there are a lot of things in here that you won't need and you can clean up. Some people actually go and clean a lot of those things up. But it actually takes a while, especially if you are in a slow connection, because it has to download them every single time you create a new project, right? And you will see that this is not really small. This is actually more than 300 megabytes, if I remember correctly. Yeah, 305 megabytes, which is not a small size, right? So that's one of the things in Angular, right? Okay, now let's see the Blazor application. How does the Blazor application works? This is a Blazor WebAssembly application with .NET Core hosted API. This is to be able to compare as close as possible to an Angular application, because your Angular application will actually have a client and a server, right? The only thing is that the client and the server are in the same project. You will have your client-side application inside a folder in here, but this is a .NET Core application. This is uh, it has the controllers in here, right? So you will have that in there. In the Blazor WebAssembly application with .NET Core hosted, you will have the client separated or separate from the server. So in here we will have the client application, and here we will have our endpoints, right? How does this work? So when you are working with Blazor WebAssembly application with .NET Core hosted APIs, the main execution project is the server project, right? So you will go in here to the program.cs, right? And you will see that it has the default program.cs configuration to start your host builder and use a startup file. The startup file will have some default configuration. You will add controllers with views to the services, and it will add the Razor Pages services, right? You will have configuration if you are in development. In development, use the development exception page and the WebAssembly plugin, right? Then the HTTPS redirection. It will, at this line, use Blazor framework files, right? Basically, so configures the application to serve Blazor WebAssembly framework files from the root path, right? Allows you to use the static files, and it maps the pages, the controllers, and the fallback file, which is going to be the index.html, right? Okay, so basically when you load the application, you will navigate to the index.html that is defined in your client-side application, right? Actually, you will see that the server side has, the server project has a reference to the client project, right? So when it compiles, it will actually take the files from the www root and merge them in the execution folder, right? Okay, the www root from your client side has the index.html, right? And it has this line, deep ID equals app loading. This is similar to the main selector in an Angular application, right? The thing is that this is configured in your program.cs. Okay. Blazor WebAssembly executes as WebAssembly in your browser, so it also has an entry point. So as soon as you load your index file is as soon as your client side is recognized by the browser, it will execute this main, right? And it will tell that the root component is going to be named with this name, the app, right? And it will map to your index.html div where you are going to render the application, right? Then you start adding the services and whatever else you need in here, which is the default .NET Core way to configure services. The only difference in here is that you are doing it in the program.cs, because we do not use a startup, though I think you could configure it to use a startup, right? And be more specific in those things, right? Because you can actually do a lot of things with the builder, right? You can add configuration, you can do the build, right? You can configure container, you can do a lot of things, right? So yeah, you could do a lot. Let's see. But now this is the app, right? And it will tell you this, right? And the one thing that you will see is that we are mapping this ID to this type name app, right? This type name app is the Blazor router, right? So you will see that it has the router. It tells or it invokes, like, it configures the application assembly. It configures like the default layout, which is going to be main layout, right? And then since the router is already preferred configured, it will go to your page with the default route, which is always going to be a blank route or single slash, right? Which is the way in which you do blanks, or the default route in Blazor, right? And all of those are going to always use the main layout. So basically the way it will render is it will render a page, a sidebar, a main component, a content, and inside the content it will render the body, and the body will be the actual body corresponding to the component which has the route the browser is at the moment. Okay. Now I am going to change this to be my startup project, and I will execute this application. Okay, so we will see that this application is similar in behavior to the Angular template. It has a default page, it has a counter, and it has a fetch data page. The fetch data will invoke my controller, return some data, and render it. So you will see I go to the counter, I can click it, right, and I go to fetch data, and it will return the data, right? How does it do that? So you will see that in my client application I have this. I have the pages, and each of these pages is going to have a attribute to indicate which route or routes, because you can support multiple, this component is going to be invoked with or at. So when I hit the default route in the browser, it will use the index component or page. When I use the slash fetch data, this is the one which is going to be executed. And when I use the slash counter, this is the one who is going to be executed. And I can keep doing things like here, like this, counter 2, right? And I can start the application, and I can go to that link, right? And it will render my counter page. So I will do this, counter 2, right? And you see that it actually loads my counter. If I hit something else, it just tells me, sorry, there is nothing at this address because there is no route supporting it at, there's no component assigned to that route at the moment. Okay, I'll just remove this, and we are going to see the fetch data the fetch data, the thing that it has is it injects an HTTP client using .NET Core default dependency injection behavior, right? And this HTTP client, it's already configured with the base address indicating it the base URL of where my API is hosted, right? So we define all of the template for the page, right? This is a variable which in this case is defined at the bottom in a code section, right, where we have this weather forecast variable, right? And on initialize for the component, we assign the value of the result to this call. So it will invoke the weather forecast endpoint in my server project, right? And it will assign those results to a variable of weather forecast array. Then this variable will have data, and when this variable has data, it will proceed to render the table, right? Now notice this. Contrary to the Angular application, I am only having to create one model because I can use the same class in both my client-side project and in my server-side project. Actually, when you create Blazor Webassembly applications with .NET Core hosted APIs, one of the things that you will notice is that it creates three projects: the client project, the server project, and a shared project, which is usually used for you to have the definition of the classes and models, whatever you need to use in both of those projects, right? It is reusable code through your client and server, right? Mostly the types, so you don't have to create or duplicate your code, right? You will also notice that, contrary to the Angular application, we do not have the node models. So this application will actually be cleaner because we don't have a lot of dependencies that we may not need, at least in our default template, right? So that's another of the advantages. This is also something like I will say it's like a personal preference. I feel that this way to structure the projects is actually much cleaner than in the Angular applications. In Angular applications, I feel they are like a little bit mess or not really sorted, right? Because you kind of see it like everywhere, right? So I do not really like that, right? So you have, for example, the client app in here, right? And you have the source, right? And then you have the app, and then you have all of your pretty much a folder for each of your component, right? Where you will have your pages, right? The HTML, the TSS, and your CSS and all that, right? You have something similar in Blazor, but the thing is that you will actually do it by naming convention. So you will have something like actually in here, main layout.razor, main layout.razor.css, and if you want to implement the CS file, or what some people call code behind in Razor, you will have main layout.razor.cs. Okay, So that's a little bit of Angular versus Blazor. So remember, the decision on which to choose should, in theory, be based on your system requirements, the technology advantages and disadvantages, and with a really strong focus on your individual or team skills, right? Some people are stronger with Angular, some people are stronger with .NET. Also, one of the things with Blazor is that one of its main strengths or purposes is to allow .NET developers or to facilitate .NET developers to create full stack applications, right? So if some .NET developer does not have knowledge in Angular, they will be able to start creating full stack applications, right? Because they will be programming everything with .NET. And in the front end, of course, they will still have to use HTML, CSS, and in some cases, JavaScript, right? But the learning curve is actually a little bit smaller than learning Angular, right? Because you already have your .NET knowledge and you will be able to reuse more of that. Even more, since you are working with .NET in your client side, you will be able to reutilize a lot of the code you have already created for .NET in your client side, in your front end, right? So personally, I like Blazor the most, right? And most of my projects lately are actually developed in Blazor WebAssembly with .NET Core hosted APIs, right? Um, but yeah, that's mostly a personal preference, and because I can code much faster with it, right? And I like speed, right? But yeah, so remember, if you want to, which one you want to choose will be depending on your team skills, right? Your strengths and weaknesses, as long as the technology, your system requirements, and the technology's advantages and disadvantages. So that's it for this. Thank you very much. Remember to subscribe to the channel, invite more people, like the videos, and share them in your social networks. Please let us know which technologies are you using, and let us know which one you choose. Have a great day.